A biased security guard brazenly targeted a black woman, not for her actions but for the color of her skin. However, when her true identity was revealed, it left him speechless. His career built on arrogance and prejudice collapsing before his very eyes. This isn't just a story about exposing abuse of power. It's a stark reminder of the dangers of bias and injustice. Stay with us to uncover this powerful tale, and don't forget to subscribe for more thought-provoking stories. At 42 years old, Camille Lawson had accomplished what few could, becoming the district police chief, a position of significant authority and respect in law enforcement. Yet what truly set Camille apart wasn't her title. Behind her composed exterior and sharp intellect was a woman who had overcome countless challenges to achieve her position. From the beginning of her career, Camille faced skepticism and prejudice as a woman of color in a field traditionally dominated by men. There were suspicious glances, whispers behind her back, and even outright dismissive comments. But instead of allowing them to break her, Camille used these experiences as fuel for her ambition. In her role as district police chief, Camille Lawson stood firm against injustice, tirelessly working toward fairness and equality. Outside her uniform, however, Camille preferred a quieter life. She believed a person's true value lay not in their status or authority, but in how they treated others. On her days off, Camille was just another person blending into the crowd. On peaceful weekend mornings, she swapped her uniform for jeans and a simple t-shirt, becoming her authentic self, a woman who enjoyed grocery shopping, walking through the park, and doting on her beloved Labrador Max. Despite her professional success, Camille never forgot her childhood. A memory burned into her mind was a humiliating experience at 10 years old. A store clerk accused her of stealing after she had lingered too long near a display. That moment of shame and helplessness became a driving force in her life, a reminder of the change she wanted to see in the world. This is Camille Lawson, a compassionate, intelligent, and strong woman who faced every challenge with determination. But on one peaceful morning, a moment would arise to test the principles she had built her life upon. In a crowded supermarket under bright fluorescent lights, Camille stepped through the automatic doors, unaware that a security guard named Greg Sanders had already marked her as a suspect. His prejudice didn't allow him to see an ordinary woman shopping. To him, Camille was a target. The scene shifted from calm to tense as Greg's ingrained bias turned a peaceful shopping trip into a confrontation. The glass doors slid open with a soft hum, and Camille entered, holding a plastic shopping basket that swayed gently in her hand. Wearing casual jeans, sneakers, and a plain shirt, she blended seamlessly into the crowd. For Camille, this wasn't about her position or status. It was simply a relaxing Saturday outing, a way to escape her demanding role. The supermarket was a place she frequented to unwind. She enjoyed the routine of picking up essentials, groceries, cleaning supplies, and occasionally a toy for Max. But her moment of peace didn't last. As Camille examined a box of cereal, a prickle of unease crept up her spine. She felt someone's eyes on her. At first, she dismissed it, reminding herself that years in law enforcement had heightened her sense of awareness. But the feeling lingered. At the end of the aisle, Greg Sanders, a tall man in a security uniform, stood with arms crossed, his eyes locked on Camille with an expression of open suspicion. Maybe it's just a coincidence, she thought, trying to shrug off the discomfort. Yet, when she moved to another aisle, Greg followed. He kept his distance, but made no attempt to conceal his presence. Greg wasn't your average security guard. Years of working in high-crime neighborhoods had twisted his perception. He had developed a habit of profiling people based solely on appearances. To Greg, anyone who didn't fit his idea of trustworthy was a potential threat. And that morning, Camille Lawson, a black woman dressed simply, became his unwitting target. Every step Camille took was shadowed by Greg's watchful eyes. He convinced himself this was his professional instinct at work, but it wasn't. It was prejudice deeply embedded in his mindset. What Greg didn't realize was that his assumptions were leading him down a path to a life-changing mistake. Camille, trying to stay calm, felt her instincts as a police officer kicking in. Something was about to happen, and she wasn't about to let it go unnoticed. Camille Lawson told herself it couldn't be a coincidence. The constant presence of the security guard wasn't just unnerving, it felt deliberate. Deciding to test her suspicions, she abruptly changed direction, walking toward a quieter section of the store. As she stopped near the cleaning supplies aisle, there he was again, Greg Sanders. His familiar figure stood at the end of the aisle, closer this time. Arms crossed, his intense gaze never left her. Around them, shoppers went about their day, oblivious to the unfolding tension. But Camille knew this wasn't in her head. Greg wasn't simply watching, he was waiting, and she could feel her peaceful morning unraveling into a confrontation she hadn't anticipated. The atmosphere grew heavier. Inside, a simmering indignation rose within Camille. Was this the moment she needed to stand her ground? Not just for herself, but for all who had been unfairly targeted in situations like this? She moved slowly through the aisles, pretending to focus on her shopping list, though the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave her. Out of the corner of her eye, she spotted Greg, his tall frame leaning against a shelf. His arms remained crossed, his stare filled with open suspicion. For Camille, being observed wasn't new. Her line of work had often placed her under scrutiny. But this wasn't the gaze of respect or admiration, it was one of mistrust and prejudice. Greg Sanders had already made up his mind about Camille the moment he saw her. To him, a black woman in simple attire, moving from aisle to aisle, couldn't possibly be innocent. Camille paused in the household goods section to examine a set of dishes, her every move shadowed by Greg, who stood so close she could feel his presence. What frustrated Camille more than his scrutiny was his complete disregard for everything else happening around them. At the far end of the aisle, a white man in an oversized coat was behaving suspiciously, furtively glancing around as he appeared to slip an item into his pocket. Camille observed the man for a moment, waiting to see if Greg would notice or act. But he didn't. Greg's focus remained solely on her, as though every potential wrongdoing in the store centered on her alone. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, Camille knew what this was. She had faced it before, and had seen countless others experience the same treatment. This wasn't about anything she'd done, it was about how she looked. Greg believed he was simply doing his job. Years in security had convinced him that his instincts were unshakable. But those instincts were warped by prejudice, shaped by years of stereotypes reinforced by narrow experiences. He told himself he was protecting the store, but in truth he was profiling. What Greg failed to see was how much his bias dictated his actions. He had grown up hearing warnings about people who didn't look like his family. Stories meant to teach caution but which instead bred fear and mistrust. Camille understood the depths of his prejudice. She had seen it before, in different forms and faces. A thought crossed her mind. If I weren't a police chief, if I didn't have this authority, how much worse would this be? Greg, on the other hand, had no idea he had chosen the wrong person to target. His smugness would soon evaporate, replaced by something far more humbling. Camille placed the set of dishes back on the shelf and moved toward another aisle, a decision already forming in her mind. She wouldn't let this go. Not just for her own dignity, but for every person who had ever been treated this way. But first, she needed to see how far Greg would take his behavior. As she entered the cleaning supplies section, a sharp, cold voice cut through the air behind her. "You, stop right there. I need to check your bag immediately." The words sliced through the hum of the store, heavy and sharp. Camille turned slowly, her eyes locking onto Greg's smug expression. His posture screamed triumph, as though he held an unshakable verdict in his hands. Nearby shoppers, startled by the confrontation, paused. Whispers began to ripple through the aisles as curious onlookers turned their attention to the scene unfolding. Greg stepped forward, his voice laced with accusation. "You've been acting suspiciously since you came in. Switching aisles, looking around like you're avoiding me," he said, his tone loud enough for those nearby to hear. To Greg, this wasn't just about checking Camille's bag. It was about proving himself right. Years of profiling had convinced him his assumptions were infallible. But Greg hadn't counted on Camille Lawson. Her steady, unwavering gaze met his, not with fear or submission, but with a quiet strength that would soon shift the power dynamic entirely. The tension in the store hung heavy as Greg Sanders strode toward Camille Lawson, his footsteps echoing sharply against the tiled floor. His voice, tinged with accusation, rang out. "You've been acting very suspiciously since you walked in here," he declared, loud enough to draw the attention of nearby shoppers. "Switching aisles, looking around like you're trying to avoid me." This wasn't just about a routine bag check for Greg. It was a chance to validate his instincts, to prove once again that he was always right. He recalled moments in the past when he had stopped shoplifters, experiences that had falsely reinforced his belief that his suspicions were infallible. But what Greg failed to see was a pattern. His so-called instincts consistently targeted people who didn't look like him. His misplaced pride in his spot trouble had blinded him to the reality of his actions. He was abusing his power. Today, as he glared at Camille, he didn't see a customer simply shopping. He saw an image constructed in his mind, a preconceived judgment he didn't think could be wrong. Shoppers around them began to notice the confrontation, their faces reflecting curiosity and unease. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "What's going on?" A middle-aged woman murmured to her companion. "Did she do something wrong?" Another voice asked, but no one had answers. As Greg continued to accuse Camille of suspicious behavior, the crowd's initial curiosity shifted to discomfort. "This is outrageous," a man muttered to his wife. "He doesn't even have any proof." Nearby, a young woman raised her phone and began recording the scene. Camille took a deep breath, her anger bubbling just beneath the surface. This wasn't the first time she had been treated this way, but the public humiliation stung deeply. Before she could speak, Greg pressed on, his tone even sharper. "If you've got nothing to hide," he sneered, "then there's no reason to refuse a bag check. Hand it over now." Camille's grip on her shopping bag instinctively tightened. She raised her head, her gaze icy and unflinching. Her voice, though measured, carried a commanding weight. "Are you accusing me of stealing?" she asked, her tone piercing through the heavy silence. Greg raised an eyebrow, a mocking smile tugging at his lips. "I'm not accusing anyone," he replied, though his tone betrayed his words. "I'm just doing my job. If you've got nothing to hide, it'll be easier to just prove it." The two stood facing each other like opponents in a battle. Camille took a deliberate step forward, narrowing the space between them, not out of submission, but to meet his challenge head-on. Her voice, clear and sharp, cut through the tension like a blade. "And you think I deserve to be checked for what reason?" she demanded. "Because I'm shopping? Or because I don't fit your idea of what's normal?" Her question struck Greg like an unexpected blow. He hesitated for a moment, but quickly regained his defensive posture, doubling down on his authority. "Don't make this personal," he retorted. "I'm just following store policy. You know, we've had issues with people like you before." The implication in his words was unmistakable, and Camille wasn't the only one who noticed. The discomfort on the faces of those in the crowd grew more pronounced, their whispers growing louder. "You should be careful with your words," Camille said, her voice low and steely like a blade fresh from the forge. "I don't have to prove anything to you. If you think you have the right to humiliate me in front of everyone here, you're mistaken." Greg scoffed, though the flicker of doubt in his eyes betrayed his confidence. "If you won't cooperate, I'll have to ask you to leave," he said loudly, trying to reclaim control of the situation. Camille met his gaze, her voice firm and unwavering. "Go ahead," she said, her eyes sweeping over the crowd, now fully engrossed in the confrontation. "And remember, everyone here will witness how you treated an innocent customer." The tension reached a boiling point. The atmosphere was so thick it felt nearly suffocating. Shoppers were no longer passive observers. They had become participants in the unfolding drama. For Camille, there was no fear in her eyes, only determination. She wasn't just standing up for herself. She was standing up for everyone who had been unfairly treated, for those Greg believed he could intimidate without consequence. This time, Camille wouldn't back down. She slowly placed her shopping basket on the floor, her movements deliberate and powerful. It was as though she was preparing for a fight, not one of fists but of principles, a confrontation she refused to lose. Camille Lawson stood her ground, her hands lightly clasped in front of her, her posture straight and commanding. Her unwavering gaze locked onto Greg Sanders, who now seemed smaller under her cold, piercing stare. "You said my behavior was suspicious," Camille began, her voice sharp and steady, cutting through the tense silence that had settled over the store. Exactly how? What have I done to make you suspicious? The question, simple but weighty, caught Greg off guard. He blinked, momentarily unsure of himself. He hadn't expected Camille to respond so directly. Shoppers who had previously been focused on their carts and lists were now entirely absorbed in the scene. Their skeptical and indignant glances shifted toward Greg, who took a deep breath in a futile attempt to regain his earlier confidence. "Well," he said, raising an eyebrow in what he thought was a commanding gesture, though his voice had lost its sharpness. "You kept changing directions, walking back and forth between aisles, looking around like you were avoiding me. That's suspicious behavior." Camille let out a soft, mirthless laugh, her eyes never leaving Greg's face. Her expression was unreadable, but her words were laden with challenge. "So, in your eyes," she said slowly, "a woman browsing through the store, minding her own business, is enough to be suspicious?" Her voice remained steady, but each word pierced Greg's flimsy reasoning like a needle through fabric. Camille stepped closer, closing the space between them until there was no mistaking her presence. Her voice sharpened, every word deliberate and slicing through his arrogance. "You said I deserve to be checked for suspicious behavior. Then tell me, how exactly do you define that? Is it walking through aisles? Or is it simply having a skin color that doesn't match yours?" Greg faltered, his confidence cracking under the weight of her words. He hesitated, as though searching for a rebuttal, but found none. Instead, he raised an eyebrow in a weak attempt to maintain his composure, his posture stiff with defensiveness. Before he could respond, Camille cut through his silence. Her voice, calm yet cutting, carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. "Or perhaps," she said, her tone as cold as steel, "you're choosing to ignore what's happening right behind you." She pointed to the end of the aisle, where a white man stood near a shelf, just trying to discreetly slip an item into his oversized coat. His furtive movements were unmistakable. "The truly suspicious person is right there," Camille said firmly. "But you didn't notice him, did you? You were too busy trying to humiliate me in front of everyone here." The crowd collectively seemed to hold its breath. A woman nearby gasped, her voice breaking the silence. "He's stealing." Caught off guard, the man fumbled with the item before bolting from the store. But by now, all eyes had turned back to Greg, their expressions a mix of outrage and disbelief. Greg cleared his throat, folding his arms tightly across his chest in a defensive gesture. "That's not the case," he muttered, his voice wavering. "This store has had problems with people like you." The air grew heavier, the weight of his words hanging in the room like a bomb waiting to explode. Whispers rippled through the crowd, their unease turning to anger. Camille tilted her head slightly, her gaze never wavering. The subtle motion carried an undeniable authority. Her voice rang out, sharp and unyielding. "What exactly do you mean by people like me?" she asked, her tone daring him to speak his true thoughts. "Go ahead, say it out loud. Or are you too afraid to admit what you're implying?" Greg froze, caught off guard. For a fleeting moment, uncertainty flickered across his face, but the mask of arrogance returned just as quickly. "Don't make this complicated," he said hastily, trying to reclaim his authority. "I'm not being discriminatory, I'm just doing my job." "Doing your job?" Camille raised an eyebrow, her gaze filled with disdain. "Then tell me, Greg, who exactly are you protecting this store from? A woman shopping peacefully, or the man over there, the one you ignored completely while he stuffed merchandise into his coat?" Her words hit the room like an explosion. Heads turned toward the corner of the store where the man had been. The whispers grew louder, fueled by disbelief and outrage. A woman shook her head, muttering, "Unbelievable. He accuses her instead." Greg, realizing he was cornered, stood rigidly, his eyes darting between Camille and the crowd as if searching for an escape route. But there was none. The confidence he had shown earlier had dissolved, leaving only embarrassment and anger in its wake. Camille took a step closer, her footsteps echoing sharply against the floor. Each step was deliberate, her presence commanding. "You thought I'd stay silent, didn't you?" she said, her voice calm but filled with unmistakable power. "You thought I'd lower my head and let you insult me because you have a little authority. You were wrong, Greg." The atmosphere had shifted entirely in Camille's favor. The crowd, once passive, began to murmur louder. Phones were raised, recording the confrontation. A young man near the front of the crowd spoke up, his voice clear and firm. "She's right. You owe her an apology." Greg opened his mouth, but no words came out. His shoulders tensed as he looked around, but every gaze was now fixed on him with disapproval. Camille's unyielding gaze bore into him, all traces of arrogance erased from his face. The balance of power had shifted, and Greg was left with nothing but silence. Camille Lawson stood tall, her piercing gaze fixed unwaveringly on Greg Sanders, whose once confident demeanor now cracked under the weight of his mounting humiliation. Her voice, steady and composed, cut through the tension like the rush of a powerful river. "You chose the wrong person to confront," she said, her words deliberate and sharp, landing like a final judgment. "And you'll never forget this moment, when an entire room saw you lose control because of the injustice you created." The room fell silent, the crowd's murmurs momentarily stilled as Greg stood motionless. Unable to respond, he finally turned and walked away, his steps slow and heavy, leaving Camille standing in the midst of a gathering audience. The tension, once suffocating, was broken by a ripple of applause. Camille exhaled deeply, her breath steadying her as she picked up her shopping basket. Her steps were resolute, each one a symbol of defiance and strength. She was no longer just another shopper. She was someone who had stood her ground, challenged prejudice, and emerged victorious. Greg's retreat hadn't ended the matter for Camille. Her sharp gaze followed him momentarily before turning to the young employee he had summoned. Without flinching, she addressed him, her tone calm yet commanding. "If you're certain about this situation," Camille said, enunciating each word, "then bring your manager here. Now." The young employee blinked, clearly caught off guard by her composed but firm demand. Greg, however, didn't hesitate. Gripping his radio, he spoke in a voice that carried false authority. "Manager, report to the cleaning supplies section. There's an incident that needs your attention." As Greg lowered the radio, his eyes darted toward Camille, trying to read her reaction. But all he met was a steady, almost blade-like glare. Camille didn't flinch or betray the slightest hint of unease. Her calm composure seemed to unsettle him further. Refusing to relinquish control, Greg called over another employee, a younger man in a store uniform who arrived with a mix of curiosity and nervousness. "What's going on here?" the employee asked, his voice low but edged with skepticism. It was as though Camille had already been cast as the defendant in an unspoken trial where Greg played the prosecutor. Taking a deep breath, Camille steadied herself against the frustration that bubbled beneath the surface. Keeping her gaze steady on both men, she spoke, her voice sharp and deliberate. "What's going on?" she repeated, her tone cutting. "I'm shopping, and he's accusing me of suspicious behavior without any legitimate reason, other than his flawed instincts." The younger employee glanced at Greg, silently asking for confirmation. Greg nodded quickly, his face lighting up with a brief glimmer of satisfaction, as though reassured by this small show of implied support. But before either of them could say more, a voice from the crowd broke the mounting tension. "This isn't the first time this has happened." The words came from an older woman with thinning silver hair who had stepped forward from the onlookers. Her disapproving gaze fixed on Greg as she continued. "I saw this same man do something similar to a young black boy a few weeks ago. The child was just looking at toys, but he accused him of stealing without a shred of proof." Her words landed like a spark igniting dry tinder, setting off a blaze of indignation in the crowd. Conversations grew louder, and curious glances turned into angry glares, aimed squarely at Greg. A few other shoppers nodded in agreement, as though they too had witnessed or heard of similar behavior. Greg, now caught in the crossfire of rising criticism, straightened his posture in a futile attempt to maintain composure. His voice, strained and faltering, clung to the same excuse he had used before. "I'm just following store policy," he said, clinging to the phrase like a shield. "If there's an issue, the manager will handle it." Camille stepped closer, narrowing the space between herself and Greg, but her movement was not one of submission, it was one of authority. Her sharp, unyielding gaze locked onto his, making it impossible for him to look away. "Good," she said, her voice low but resonant, carrying the weight of her resolve. We'll wait right here for the manager, and I look forward to hearing how he explains your behavior in front of everyone who's watching." Her words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown, further heightening the already stifling tension. Greg remained silent, his face frozen, his eyes flickering between confusion and simmering frustration. For the first time during the encounter, he seemed to realize he was losing control. The crowd was no longer passive. A young man called out from the back, his voice clear and unwavering. "She's right. You owe her an apology." Another woman nearby clicked her tongue in disapproval. "This is unacceptable," she said, shaking her head. "Just look at how he's treating her." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the growing crowd. Some shoppers raised their phones, recording the confrontation. Others openly questioned Greg's actions or whispered words of support for Camille. Through it all, Camille remained steady, her presence unmoved by the escalating noise. She wasn't just standing up for herself. She was standing up for countless others who had been silenced, humiliated, or judged unfairly. As the voices around her grew louder, Camille's own resolve hardened. She wasn't leaving until accountability was served. Camille Lawson stood firm, her presence unwavering despite the growing noise and pressure from the crowd. This wasn't just about defending herself. It was about standing up for everyone who had ever faced similar injustice. Amid the mounting tension, a man in a crisp white shirt with a name tag appeared. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with his serious expression. The crowd's attention shifted toward him as the atmosphere became even more charged. "You've finally arrived," Camille said, addressing the store manager directly. Her voice was steady and authoritative, cutting through the thick tension. "I want an explanation, right here, right now, for how your employee has treated an innocent customer." The manager's eyes swept across the aisle, taking in the scene before him. His gaze moved from the gathered crowd to Greg Sanders, and finally to Camille. It didn't take him long to realize this wasn't a simple misunderstanding. Every word he said, every action he took, would now be publicly scrutinized by the crowd, hanging on to every detail. The sound of hurried footsteps shattered the heavy silence as the manager stepped closer, his face pale with concern. His eyes darted from Camille to Greg, who stood stiffly, visibly uneasy under the weight of the crowd's judgment. "What's going on here?" the manager asked, his voice trembling slightly despite his attempt to appear composed. Greg, eager to regain control, stepped forward quickly. He straightened his posture, though the tension in his shoulders betrayed his discomfort. "She's been acting very suspiciously," he said, pointing at Camille with exaggerated confidence. "I was just following store policy. I asked to check her bag, but she's refusing to cooperate." Camille stood motionless, as immovable as a mountain. Her sharp gaze dissected Greg's every word. Calmly, she bent down to pick up her shopping basket, then walked toward the manager with an air of quiet authority. "So this is how you treat your customers?" she asked, her voice cold and cutting, like a winter wind slicing through the room. "Following them, accusing them, and publicly humiliating them, without a shred of evidence?" The manager faltered under her words. His gaze flicked nervously between Camille and Greg. "Ma'am, if there's been any misunderstanding, I sincerely apologize," he stammered. "But Mr. Sanders here was just doing his job, trying to ensure store security." Camille narrowed her eyes, a faint sardonic smile curling her lips. Before the manager could say another word, she reached into her back pocket and pulled out a small object. She raised it, allowing the overhead lights to catch its polished surface. A badge gleamed brightly, its presence instantly captivating everyone in the room. Time seemed to stand still as shock rippled through the crowd. The expressions on Greg's face, the manager's, and the onlookers transformed from curiosity and suspicion to astonishment and disbelief. "She's a police chief," a voice from the crowd exclaimed, breaking the silence. Nearby customers exchanged incredulous glances. Greg froze where he stood, his eyes wide and his face drained of all color. I didn't know," Greg stammered, his voice trembling and stripped of the authority he had tried so hard to project. Camille's gaze remained fixed on him, her voice sharp and resolute as she spoke. "You didn't know?" she asked, her tone carrying the weight of justice. "Then let me educate you. A security officer has no right to accuse someone based on bias, and you will not justify this behavior without consequences." She paused, her voice rising with commanding power. "I'm Chief Camille Lawson," she declared. "I oversee this entire district. Did you really think accusing me without evidence was a smart decision?" Greg stood frozen, his face shifting from confusion to pale dread. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. Beside him, the younger employee who had arrived earlier was equally stunned, his wide eyes reflecting shock and disbelief. The manager stood motionless, as though rooted to the spot, his breath caught in his throat. "I didn't know," Greg stammered again, his voice faltering. "I was just following protocol, ma'am." "Following protocol?" Camille repeated, her voice cold as ice. She took a deliberate step closer, her tone quiet, yet reverberating through the room. "Then tell me, why didn't you apply your so-called protocol to the white man over there, stuffing merchandise into his coat pocket at the corner of the store? Did you not see him, or did you just choose not to look?" Her words landed like a lightning strike. Heads in the crowd turned toward the corner she pointed to, where a blond man stood furtively tucking a small item into his coat. "She's right," a woman whispered angrily. "I saw him too. He's been stealing, and no one even noticed." Caught off guard, the man bolted toward the exit, leaving no doubt about his guilt. Greg stood paralyzed, his face now ghostly pale. His eyes darted around, desperately searching for support, but the collective fury of the crowd made it clear no one was on his side anymore. The tension in the room shattered, replaced by murmurs of disbelief and outrage. Camille stood her ground, unyielding, as the crowd's judgment turned squarely on Greg. This moment would not be forgotten, not by him, nor by anyone who had witnessed it. The store manager finally broke his stunned silence, his voice trembling as he turned to Greg Sanders. "Greg, is it true? Did you ignore that man while focusing on her?" Before Greg could stammer out a reply, Camille Lawson cut through the growing tension, her voice sharp and unyielding. "I want to know," she said, her words landing like a hammer, "if you apply your so-called rules to everyone, or if you only target people like me." The weight of her question pressed down on the room, making it impossible for anyone to look away. The crowd, once a passive collection of onlookers, now hung on every word. The manager, visibly shaken, turned back to Camille. "Ma'am, I'm deeply sorry," he stammered, his voice quaking. "We'll handle this immediately." Camille didn't let him finish. Her voice, razor-sharp, cut through his words. "Sorry isn't enough," she said firmly. "I want assurance that this will never happen again. Not to me, not to anyone else." She turned her attention to the gathered crowd, her voice rising with strength and conviction. "This isn't just about me," she declared. "This is about all of us. It's about saying no to prejudice and injustice, something we've tolerated for far too long." The crowd seemed to draw energy from her words. A few people nodded in agreement, and scattered applause rippled through the room. Greg, meanwhile, stared at the ground, unable to lift his head or meet anyone's eyes. The manager stood frozen, unsure of how to proceed beyond nodding in agreement with Camille's demands. Camille cast a sweeping glance around the store, her gaze blazing with determination. "Remember this," she said, her voice clear and resonant like a final decree. "No one has the right to accuse others simply because they're different." With that, she picked up her shopping basket and walked away, her steps resolute. She left behind a crowd filled with reflection, admiration, and people forever changed by what they had witnessed. The air in the aisle grew stifling as Camille revealed her identity, her badge a symbol of unshakable authority. Greg, who had once exuded confidence and arrogance, now stood motionless, his face pale. He struggled to find words, but the truth was glaringly obvious. Camille's piercing gaze remained locked on him, her voice calm yet cutting through the silence like a blade. "You think you can act without accountability?" she asked, her tone sharp and deliberate. "I want your full name, position, and any other relevant information. I'll be reporting this behavior to your superiors." Greg drew a deep breath, as if clinging to the last remnants of his dignity. His voice trembled as he replied, "Greg Sanders, security guard." "Write it down," Camille interrupted. She then turned her eyes toward the manager, her voice steady and commanding. "I want to make sure this behavior isn't ignored or covered up." The manager, flustered and visibly anxious, nodded repeatedly. Turning to Greg, his tone was heavy and firm. "Greg," the manager said, his voice now devoid of the earlier uncertainty. I have to say, this isn't the first time I've heard about behavior like this from you." The statement struck Greg like a direct blow, his face betraying his shock. All eyes in the crowd turned toward him, their disapproving murmurs growing louder. "Not the first time?" Camille repeated, her tone laced with restrained anger. Before the manager could explain, a young man in the crowd stepped forward, pointing at Greg with a voice full of indignation. "I've been followed by him too," the man said. "Just a few weeks ago. I wasn't doing anything wrong, but he kept trailing me like I was about to steal something." An older woman nodded in agreement. "This happens all the time," she said. "We've all seen it, but no one wanted to speak up because we didn't want trouble." Greg lowered his head, his eyes avoiding everyone's. The smugness he had displayed earlier was completely replaced by evident shame. The manager, left with no choice, turned to Greg. His voice was heavy as he spoke. "Greg, you're suspended, effective immediately. We don't tolerate this kind of behavior in our store." Greg opened his mouth as if to protest, but Camille's unyielding gaze silenced him. Her silence spoke volumes, crushing any resistance he might have had. Turning back to the manager, Camille nodded slowly. "You better review your policies and procedures," she said firmly. "I will file a full report to ensure this doesn't happen again." The manager nodded fervently, while murmurs of approval began to ripple through the crowd. A few people even clapped lightly, showing their support for Camille and their frustration with Greg's discriminatory actions. The incident didn't end there. In the days that followed, the store's management not only suspended Greg, but also committed to significant changes in their operations. Camille made it explicitly clear that the store needed mandatory training sessions on cultural awareness and anti-racism for all employees. "This isn't just the responsibility of individuals," Camille stated firmly. "It's a systemic issue." Just a few days later, the store chain announced through various media channels that it would implement nationwide training programs and establish a hotline for reporting discriminatory behavior. Camille's actions had sparked not just accountability, but a broader movement for meaningful reform. This moment wasn't just about one person. It was about creating a ripple effect of change. The announcement of a hotline for customers and employees to report discriminatory behavior was met with widespread praise. It signaled progress, but also served as a stark reminder. Meaningful change requires constant vigilance and oversight. As the situation in the store settled, Camille Lawson picked up her shopping basket and walked toward the exit. Her steps were heavy, each one burdened by frustration and a deep, unspoken pain. The cold air rushing through the automatic doors hit her. But it did nothing to extinguish the quiet indignation simmering within her. Morning sunlight streamed through the glass, reflecting off her face, but instead of dispelling the darkness in her soul, it seemed to illuminate the weight pressing down on her thoughts. She paused briefly at the entrance, her eyes scanning the store behind her. Inside, life had returned to normal. Shoppers pushed carts across the polished floors, their conversations mingling with the playful laughter of children. It was a scene of ordinary routine, untouched by the confrontation that had taken place moments earlier. But for Camille, everything had changed. She felt like an outsider, standing on the edge of a world she no longer trusted. A single question echoed in her mind, relentless and unanswerable. How many people have been treated unjustly, like I was today? How many without power or a voice have endured this in silence, unable to defend themselves? Faces filled her thoughts, nameless individuals, women, children, people of color like her. All of them judged, belittled, and accused because of their appearance or background. Memories surged forward, overwhelming her in a wave of anguish she thought she had long overcome. She remembered her first encounter with injustice as a child. It was a sweltering summer day when, at just 10 years old, she had accompanied her mother to a small department store. While waiting for her mother to check out, Camille had admired small trinkets she knew they couldn't afford. A store clerk approached her, his gaze filled with suspicion and disdain. "This girl is stealing," he shouted, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. Camille could still feel the searing shame, as if every light in the store had focused solely on her. Her mother had tried to defend her, but the cold accusation and baseless judgment left a scar that never fully healed. Adulthood offered little respite. When Camille decided to pursue a career in law enforcement, she believed she could change the system from within. But even on her first patrol assignment, she faced prejudice. A male colleague sneered at her, saying, "I'm sure they only picked you to meet their diversity quota." His eyes weren't those of a teammate, they were the eyes of someone who had judged her before she even had a chance to prove herself. She endured whispers, second-guessing, and skeptical glances that cut deeper than words. Those memories, once painful, had become weapons she used to forge her resolve. They turned her into the strong, unyielding woman she was today, someone unwilling to remain silent in the face of injustice. As Camille reached the parking lot, she stopped, her gaze fixed on the store behind her. Her eyes no longer burned with anger, but with steely determination. She whispered into the stillness, "This isn't just about me, it's about all of us. The ones who've endured too long, the ones who've never had the chance to stand up for themselves." Turning, she walked to her car, her steps no longer heavy but purposeful. She knew this battle was far from over, but she also knew she would never retreat. Before opening the car door, Camille glanced back at the store one last time. A glimmer of light flickered in her eyes, not of rage but of an unshakable will. "I won't stop," she said softly, as though making a vow to herself and to all those who had remained silent. "I will fight, not just for me, but for everyone who cannot speak out." Sliding into the driver's seat, Camille turned the key, and the engine roared to life, blending with the soft rustle of the wind. It was more than just a sound, it was a declaration, the beginning of a new journey. This time, Camille was not just a woman fighting against injustice, she was a flame, a symbol of change, and she would never let that flame go out. As Camille rested her hands on the steering wheel, she didn't immediately drive away. Her sharp gaze stared ahead, piercing into the depths of a far larger problem. The events of the morning weren't the end of the story, they were just the beginning. Greg's suspension, while necessary, was like extinguishing a single flame in a forest that still smoldered with the fires of systemic prejudice. Greg was just one small cog in a machine corroded by bias, and Camille knew the fight would need to go beyond this one incident. Pulling out her phone, she opened her notes app and began typing her next steps. First, she would file a formal report with the store's corporate headquarters. That was non-negotiable. But Camille knew that systemic change required more than holding one individual accountable. She drafted plans to collaborate with community leaders and nonprofits to raise awareness about the insidious effects of everyday prejudice. She would push for mandatory training on cultural sensitivity and anti-racism, not as a performative gesture but as a transformative process. The fight for justice couldn't be a fleeting effort. It needed to be unrelenting, driven by people willing to speak up, even when the world tried to silence them. Closing her notes app, Camille set her phone down. A faint smile played on her lips, not of satisfaction but of hope. As she drove away, sunlight poured through the windshield, illuminating her face. It wasn't just morning light, it was a promise of a new day, a better future. Camille knew the road ahead would be long and arduous, but she also knew that every step forward, no matter how small, was worth it. She wasn't fighting for herself alone. She was fighting for a future where justice, fairness, and respect were rights, not privileges. And with that thought, the flame of her determination burned brighter than ever. The incident at the store lingered in Camille Lawson's thoughts as she reflected on the systemic prejudice that allowed such moments to occur. A system where people like her were often judged, accused, or dismissed because of their skin color, gender, or background. Determined to ensure this would not happen again, not to her, not to anyone, Camille pulled out her phone and opened her notes app. She began listing her next steps with precision and resolve. First, she would file an official report with the chain's security management. But Camille knew that a report alone wasn't enough. She needed to take broader action. One of her self-assigned missions became clear: working with the local community to raise awareness about the insidious impact of prejudice in daily life. She reached out to a nonprofit organization focused on equality, proposing workshops in the area. These sessions wouldn't just target store employees, they would be open to the entire community. Change begins with awareness. Camille thought, her fingers flying over her phone's keyboard. She decided to demand that the store chain implement mandatory, structured training on anti-racism and cultural sensitivity. Not as a token measure, but as a transformative standard, robust enough to shift mindsets and reshape behaviors across their entire workforce. Opening her email, Camille composed a letter with sharp and resolute words. Subject: urgent action required, incident of discrimination at your store. Dear Senior Management, I am Police Chief Camille Lawson, and I am writing to report a serious incident involving discriminatory behavior by one of your employees at your store earlier today. This incident reflects a deeper issue that must be addressed. I demand a thorough investigation and concrete steps to ensure such behavior does not happen again. Change begins with education. Your company must implement mandatory training on anti-racism and cultural sensitivity for all staff. Without systemic change, you risk not only losing customer trust, but also continuing to harm innocent people. I look forward to your prompt response. Sincerely, Camille Lawson. Camille pressed send and felt a small sense of relief. But she knew this was just the beginning of a much larger fight. Later that day, as Camille sat in her living room, her phone buzzed repeatedly. A friend had sent her a link with a message. This morning's incident is going viral. Opening the link, Camille found a social media post featuring a video of her confrontation with Greg. The caption read, "Police Chief Camille Lawson stands up against injustice at a local store." The video had already garnered thousands of likes, shares, and comments. Many viewers expressed admiration for Camille, while others shared their own experiences with discrimination. "I've been treated the same way," one commenter wrote. "Thank you, Camille, for speaking up for all of us," another said. Others called for store chains to overhaul their policies and implement better training for their employees. The movement grew faster than Camille anticipated. People began demanding accountability and meaningful reforms from the store chain. Her phone buzzed again, this time with an email from the chain's senior management. They pledged to implement cultural sensitivity training sessions and issued a public apology to Camille across all corporate media platforms. Reading the email, a faint smile crossed Camille's face. It was a small victory, but she knew this was far from the end. True change wouldn't come from promises alone. It would require tangible, ongoing action. That evening, Camille sat in her car, looking out at the sky, which had begun to clear after a veil of gray clouds. A wave of emotion washed over her, not of anger or frustration, but of hope. Her story had resonated with many and sparked a broader conversation about discrimination and the deeply rooted prejudices embedded in society. Starting the engine, Camille paused before driving off. She glanced back at the store one last time. Her gaze no longer carried anger. Instead, it conveyed a powerful message. This isn't the end. This is just the beginning. As she drove away, Camille left behind more than a resolved incident. She left behind a spark of inspiration for thousands. For Camille, the journey ahead wasn't about her alone. It was about fighting for fairness, giving voice to the voiceless, and building a future where everyone was treated equally. As the golden sunlight filtered through her car windows, softly brushing her face, Camille felt its warmth as a tender reassurance after the storm. But even the sun couldn't dissipate the weight of her thoughts. Camille's heart ached, not from personal pain, but from the sharp realization that the store incident was far more than an isolated event. What had happened wasn't just about her, Greg, or a single employee. It was a reflection of a deeply rooted societal problem. Persistent, invisible prejudices and stereotypes that silently hurt countless lives. She thought back to the astonished faces of the crowd when she revealed her badge. Their shift in attitude, from suspicion to respect and solidarity, left her with a bittersweet taste. If I weren't a police chief, Camille wondered, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, would the truth have come to light? Or would I have been one of the countless people who silently walked away, carrying an unseen wound? These thoughts stirred within her, adding to her determination. She realized that the respect she commanded shouldn't stem from her authority alone. It should be a basic human right. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and fairness, not because of a badge or a title, but simply because they are human. As the road stretched ahead, Camille felt a renewed sense of purpose. She was no longer just reflecting on the injustice she faced. She was ready to take the next steps toward building a fairer world. With every mile she drove, Camille's determination grew stronger. She wouldn't stop. Not now. Not ever. For Camille Lawson, the events of the day lingered in her thoughts, pulling her back into the confrontation that had exposed both injustice and her unshakable resolve. Yet the change in people's attitudes that morning wasn't due to an epiphany or sudden understanding. It was rooted in her power and position, a fact that weighed heavily on her heart. How many people without power or a voice, Camille wondered, have been forced to bow before injustice simply because they couldn't defend themselves? The question echoed in her mind, leading her to reflect on the true meaning of fairness. Power should not be the only shield against injustice. Fairness and respect must be foundational values, not privileges reserved for the few. Everyone, no matter who they are, deserves to be treated with dignity, she thought, her gaze fixed on the long road ahead. Not because of their title or appearance, but because they are human. Camille realized the importance of the day's events as a powerful reminder. You never know who you're treating unfairly. They could be a friend, a loved one, or someone with the power to change your life. But above all, they are human, with intrinsic worth. Her lips curled into a faint smile as she considered her next steps. She refused to let this incident be reduced to a single moment or an apology followed by superficial measures. Camille believed in the transformative power of small actions, of speaking up when witnessing injustice, of challenging one's own biases, and of holding systems accountable. The world won't change overnight, she reminded herself, but it can get better. One person, one action, one decision at a time. Every small change is a brick in the foundation of a fairer society. As her car rolled along the road, stretching into the distance, the sunlight poured through the windshield like a promise. It wasn't resolution that calmed Camille, but the knowledge that she had planted a seed for change. She understood her story was no longer hers alone. It was part of a larger mosaic, a tapestry woven from stories of hope, respect, and understanding. As she merged into the dense flow of traffic, Camille silently reminded herself and the world of a simple truth. Treat others fairly. Think before you judge. You never know the story they carry. The soft golden light illuminated the road ahead like nature's promise of a brighter tomorrow. Camille knew the future was still distant, but she also believed it had already begun. Weeks later, the ripple effects of Camille's stand against injustice became evident. Local news outlets praised her as the catalyst for meaningful reform. Stores across the region began implementing stricter internal policies to address discriminatory practices. Beyond the policies, Camille's story inspired others to share their own experiences. An online movement, accompanied by the hashtag #ThinkBeforeYouJudge, spread widely, encouraging people to advocate for mutual respect and challenge systemic biases. Camille Lawson's story became more than a single stand against prejudice. It was a profound reminder of how deeply our everyday interactions shape the world around us. Have you ever witnessed or experienced an injustice like Camille's? How would you handle such a situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story made you reflect or inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more meaningful stories like this one. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.